about the beginnings of cover design and discuss the first pioneers like Frank Decker and Alex Steinweiss. In the second episode, Pablo Picasso focused on the connection of the cover with facets of applied and fine art as well as the embedded history. Today, we want to talk about other pioneers who immediately left a lasting mark with their record covers.
Yeah, we will continue to look at the beginnings of decorated record covers in the USA. In other words, the key influences of the cover pioneers in the 1940s. And in my opinion, these are the three: James Flora, David Stone Martin, and Ben Shahn. Now, some experts possibly say also there is Bob Jones, who for me was less an artist and more of a designer. Bob Jones, he was an art director at Columbia Records from 1945 and succeeded Jim Flora. In 1950, he went to RCA. He experienced the rise of photography in cover design in particular.
Who should we start with?
Well, the most obvious is Jim Flora, because Alex Steinweiss hired him as an assistant. As his successor, he continued his ideas at Columbia Records. Flora attended art school for 5 years before trying to work as an assistant to a mural painter. Then worked freelance, worked as Steinweiss' assistant from 1941 and became his successor from 1943 to 1945. From this time, from 1944, I have this cover here with Bing Crosby. It's a shellac record on Columbia Records in 3 pieces. And as you can see, photography has already found its way into cover design. In my opinion, however, the best Flora covers were only created in the 50s. Jim Flora left Columbia in 1950 because he had to work too much administratively rather than creatively, and went to Mexico with his family for 1.5 years, where he worked as an artist. And this influenced him so much. The folkloristic Mexican influence can be seen in some covers. Now let me show, for example, this one of Shorty Rogers at RCA Records in 1954. And there's another interesting one from 1955 with folkloristic covers, as you can see on this cover. And it's from 1955, and as you can see, Jim Flora was an enthusiastic jazz fan. He was interested in Mexican art and was repeatedly commissioned by RCA to design covers. As a jazz fan who came to cover design through his love of music, his implementations, I citate someone who said, did not always correspond to the average idea of a normal record cover and provoked controversy. In his jazz illustrations, he expressed his preference for the dynamics of jazz, often accompanied by his humorous attitude to life. This is also the case in this cover for upcoming cover for the Sort of Finnegan Orchestra, where Flora's interpretations are more relaxed and free. Let me show this one to you. I want to talk about this cover.
I've never heard of the orchestra.
Well, the orchestra of the two arrangers, Sauter and Finnegan, was considered one of the most experimental bands of the time, combining jazz with classical music in unusual arrangements and experimenting with all kinds of unusual timbres and instruments such as a harp, a gamelan from Bali, or a kazoo, or a glockenspiel, or ratchet. The group disbanded in 1957 when Eddie Sauter became a musical director at the SWF Dance Orchestra in Baden-Baden, Germany. Through the increased use of Flora's visualized musical movement representation and the comic-like figures, which remind me a little bit of George Grosz's works from Germany and Berlin in the late 1920s, like you can see on this cover.
And how do you interpret his cover representation?
Oh, I love them so much because he really comes to the center of the interpretations. The two dancing figures are obviously Eddie Sauter and Bill Finnegan. Both figures on the cover look like maniacs, completely over the top. While the left figure with a bow tie, characteristic of Finnegan, is holding a compositional pen in his hand, the right figure, here Sauter, is clearly visible with glasses and is holding a baton in his hand. Both are dancing together. In the middle of them are indicated the multitude of their instruments and dynamics that the two share in their passionate joy of experimentation. The title of the album, Inside Sauter Finnegan, is thus implemented by this image on the chests of the two arrangers, which reminds me of the US painter here like Stuart Davis in his style of formal resolution. Here, Flora restricts himself to a few colors, in accordance with the separation technique of the print: green, pink and red on a black background. In contrast to Alex Steinweiss, however, he deliberately uses them as opposite poles to bring out the restlessness, the dynamics and the movement. In this example of the same jazz orchestra, Flora has the musical instruments in bright yellow foreground in front of a theater audience that is reminiscent of Pablo Picasso. Let me show this piece to you right away. I want to talk about this one here. You can see these yellow musical instruments of the Sauter Finnegan Orchestra, and in the background in the theater are these visitors in the theater, and they really look like Pablo Picasso's figures or maybe Jean Dubuffet. I think there is another great album that I want to talk about, which is a small 7-inch album, The War of the Bands, always also by Ralph Finnegan and Buddy Morrow from 1954, which was released on RCA Records with a typical Flora design. Here, Flora presents a kind of war. Here, of course not a real war. It's a musical, friendly, playful confrontation of action and dynamics. The musicians of the two bands shoot out sounds at each other with their instruments. And at that time, at a concert in Detroit, the spark must have jumped to the audience with the musicians cheering each other on, so that everyone present was totally excited.
The musicians are literally firing on all cylinders.
Yes, that fits perfectly. By the way, one might think be quite interesting for you as a drummer. The staccato drummer is the energetic, legendary Gene Krupa, who is to thank for the popularity of long drum solos. He was the one who was ranked at the 6th best drummer at all time by the Rolling Stone magazine.
That's nice to know. Which pioneer comes second?
Now we come to David Stone Martin. David Stone Martin attended the Art Institute in Chicago from 1933 to 1935. And in the 30s, during the Great American Depression, he worked on murals that were created thanks to President Roosevelt as part of the state-sponsored Federal Arts Project. You remember the New Deal? And you have to imagine that at that time of the Great Depression, up to 10,000 artists were unemployed. And Roosevelt used his social job creation measure to ensure that the artists could secure their livelihood. During World War II, David Stone Martin met the artist Shahn. The two of them then began a lively collaboration. Among other things, he worked with Shahn on several murals. Shahn and Stone Martin influenced Roosevelt's social attitudes through this measure. Through Martin's friendship with a jazz musician, Mary Lou Williams, he was able to design the next album of Mary Lou Williams, and thus his first album cover in 1944, which is this one. And he was immediately catapulted to an art director at Moses Ash Records. They released this album of the Mary Lou Williams trio in 1944, and it contained 3 shellac albums by Ash Records. Around 1946, Ash released the first recording of Jazz at the Philharmonic, a series of live jazz jam sessions initiated by the influential jazz impresario Norman Granz. And here is a perfect example of that. Granz was born in the USA, and he was the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants. Martin also designed this cover and met Granz in the process, for whose later label, Worth, he also contributed to the logo. Remember, Worth was created from the merger of the 2 Granz labels, Clef and Nogren, and he became his most important client. The cover shows the subject that Martin developed for Jazz at the Philharmonic series at Granz's request. It adorns Mary covers and is used in a modified form by Granz as the logo of Jazz at the Philharmonic. And also have this example, and there you can see the same jazz musician here in front in red, and this subject is always used for Jazz at the Philharmonic. This album was released in 1946 at Stinson Records with the Charlie Parker Quartet from 1955. His striking use of color is well shown in this example. The chosen view, which shows the trumpeter depicted from a warm perspective, gives the feeling that you are right at his feet, or at least in the front row at a concert. He sketched the musicians at the concerts with his quill pen, or was inspired by photographs. In doing so, he used color very sparingly, similar to Shahn, by the way. Here is another example of the representation of the jam sessions with Oscar Peterson. Let me show this one to you. It's called the Jam Sessions, in which Oscar Peterson worked as a pianist, band leader and composer with the legendary saxophonist Charlie Parker, among others. You remember him as we called him Bird. This record was issued by Columbia Records in 1955, and David Stone Martin was, as you can see, was very interested in art, and like James Flora, his great love for jazz is the basis for the cover design.
The covers have a very emotional expression.
Martin created his covers from the perspective of a visual artist who wanted to put himself in the shoes of people. Martin is primarily concerned with the person, the musician, whom he places at the center of the covers. This claim runs like a thread through Martin's work. However, the artist is most interested in the Billie Holiday covers, and they were made between 1952 and 1957. They show the emotional world of the jazz singer in various facets. Let me show this Billie Holiday cover here from 1958. It is called All or Nothing at All. Billie's childhood was anything but easy. She was raped by neighbors at the age of 10. Her father died of pneumonia in 1937 because hospitals refused to treat an African American And despite her success, she constantly had a feeling of being a second-class citizen. And she struggled with addiction problems throughout her life. She was constantly exposed to various forms of racism. She was 24 years old when she recorded the song Strange Fruit in 1939, a musical indictment against the lynching that was widespread in the southern states. And it gave her breakthrough as a recognized jazz singer because she touched the listeners at their core. Sadness and anger go hand in hand in her interpretation. And the word says, the southern trees bear strange fruits, blood on the leaves and blood on the roots. Black bodies dangle in the southern wind, strange fruits hang from the poplars. When Billy sang, you had a feeling of standing right at the foot of the tree. Oppressed, gripped by a profound pain, she forces the audience to devote their full attention to the song. And her song, Strange Fruit, was voted the best song of the century by Times Magazine 60 years later in 1999. It was the first significant protest in words and music. The song had a great symbolic power for the beginning of the civil rights movement. It alludes to the inhumane, bloody slavery in the southern states. A typification of the violent South expressed in the image of the tree with the frightening strange fruits. David Stone Martin's other examples are similarly the portrayal, for example, of Art Tatum, one of the greatest jazz pianists of all time. Let me show some examples of him, like this one. And it's the Genius of Work in volume 1 and by Clef Records from 1955. And I also have this one from 1954 as a 7-inch record. And you can see the similarities, only the different colors. Also, there's a really nice example of Art Tatum's portrayal and the piano that is shown on this one. And also I would like to refer of another David Stone Martin portrait that is quite famous because it's the album Love is Gentle Thing, and it was recorded in 1959, as you can see here, by RCA Records. And we mentioned Harry Belafonte in the last episode. Remember, Paul Robeson had promoted his career greatly. In this example, I also think the drawing of the mother with a small child here is very successful. He uses ink and the brush for his broader lines, while the finer lines of a drawing are drawn with a pen. He used a so-called quill pen tip, which he repeatedly used with unusually high pressure, so that the drawn line appeared more lively and the vitality and dynamics of jazz were reflected. The colors are then used as a supporting, striking element. Here the brown, yellowish and green colors.
How many covers do you have by Stone Martin?
Well, I have about 30 of his total around 400 record covers. And we can show and discuss them all here. But it can be said that you can get to know many of the best jazz musicians of the time through his covers. For example, here with Oscar Peterson, these two covers, and Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker and Lester Young are playing on these records. And it's a perfect example how Oscar Peterson and Duke Ellington play the music of Duke Ellington. in 1953 and 1956. But in connection with the next Oscar Peterson album, let me tell you a story about Norman Granz, the label boss, and how he courageously fought against racism. Oscar Peterson told how Granz once fearlessly insisted that white taxi drivers take on his black artists as customers. And the policeman is said to have pointed a loaded gun at his stomach during this. And he was totally courageous and unimpressed. Granz was also one of the first to pay white and black artists the same salary and to give them the same treatment in small details, such as dressing rooms in the segregated society of the 1940s. Granz was also the manager of Ella Fitzgerald, the most popular jazz singer with over 40 million records sold. And there's a beautiful cover by David Stone Martin that shows Ella in a typical pose. That's this one. It's called These Are the Blues from 1964. Norman Granz always opposed racism and fought many battles for his artists, many of whom were black and belonged to the who is who of jazz history. In 1955, in Houston, Texas, he removed signs designating white and Negro restrooms outside the auditorium, where Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie were to perform 2 concerts. Between the 2 shows, Fitzgerald and Gillespie, as well as Illinois Sheke, played small stakes dice in the dressing room to kill time as the local police stormed in and arrested them. After some negotiations, the artists were allowed to perform the second show and were later officially released on a $50 bail. Granz was outraged by the incident and insisted on successfully fighting the charges, which cost him over $2,000.
What other examples would you like to show?
Well, for example, there are the works on Charlie Parker, the saxophone player. I was already talking about him in the first episode. His nickname was Bird. You remember Birdland venue in New York, Manhattan? Now, here I would just like to quickly browse through some of his covers, art covers, as we would otherwise get completely lost in conversation about Charlie Parker. Now, here is a nice example, a 7-inch Charlie Parker on strings, which was pretty controversial and at this time using strings in jazz in 1955. And I also like this example, which is a really nice album, and it shows 6 birds and Charlie Parker as a saxophone player here with a sort of a raven on his shoulder and a nice rhythm section with Buddy Rich and other great players like Lionel Hampton and so forth. And then there's this different cover of Charlie Parker. It's a reissue, actually not the original album, and with blue vinyl. And the same is on a 7-inch, the original, and I would like to show this one here. There are a lot of nice 7-inch recordings at this time. It's the same, and he's here on the yellow side playing the sax. But I also would like to show some other 10 inches. There's the comparable one here, Charlie Parker on strings with the 2 birds. And what I really love is this one, in remembrance of Pablo Picasso, showing the bull and the torero, but the torero is playing the saxophone here. And really, really nice album. And here there's one with Dizzy Gillespie showing Parker and this on the cover. So here's Parker with the sax, and here's Dizzy Gillespie with his trumpet. And a great rhythm section here with Thelonious Monk and Max Roach and other fantastic players. And here another one showing a fish and a key, and the black is like a curtain, and in the midst of the curtain you see behind there in white David Stone Martin was was showing here the musician. Some other nice examples I would like to show is this one here. I have to make some space here. Showing Hampton and Getz on top and in a really nice gesture and colors. And you know my favorite colors is this one here in blue, yellow and red, showing all these fantastic musicians in a dynamic mood and playing around, and I think it's like in a Miro style. And a special cover that really reminds me on another great artist is this one. Here is playing Lionel Hampton and Max Roach in the rhythm section, and Max Roach probably is meant to be here in his movement on the drumming. And this really reminds me in the studies of the great British photographer Edward Muybridge. And you know, Edward Muybridge is known for his groundbreaking photo studies of the animal movement between 1878 and 1886. And he used multiple cameras to capture the different positions in the walk of a human being or animals. The human eye would not fully capture the action of fast horses, for example, trotting and galloping. Many people were amazed by the fact that a running horse had all four hooves in the air at regular intervals. I think Stone Martin had these layers of movement in mind when he depicted the drummer's hand. Let me show another example of Edward Muybridge on a different cover here at a Philip Glass album of 1983 called The Photographer. And there you can see the typical study of the horse's movement. And why I'm so sure of this, shown by this cover by Stone Martin, which has a photo of Edward Muybridge in the background of the two musicians. There is exactly this album, and you remember the series Jazz at the Philharmonic, and here's the issue number 12, and it shows two turquoise black musicians, and in the background you can see a horse and a man riding the horse, exactly from a photography of Edward Muybridge. So I think this is proof enough that David Stone Martin had Edward Muybridge in mind when he was designing the cover with the drummer's movement.
But you also told me that the protest singer from the last episode and friend of Paul Robeson, Pete Seeger, is also there, right?
Oh yes, we definitely have to show that one too. There is a nice record, it's called Sleep Time Songs from 1958 by Pete Seeger, with a really nice cover of David Stone Martin, which is this one. The album is rather untypically for Seeger. It has children's songs and bedtime stories. The child on the cover here symbolizes that you can sing children to sleep with the songs. At the moment, his song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, is being played a lot again due to the military conflicts we have in these days. His song contributed to a lot to the civil rights movement in the USA. Just think of We Shall Overcome, or the anti-war song Last Train to Nuremberg, which addressed the US war crimes in Vietnam. and brought me the issue into public awareness.
So, and now all the good things come in threes. We come to the last pioneer in today's podcast episode.
Exactly. The last pioneer, it's Ben Shahn, whom we mentioned at the beginning in the biography of David Stone Martin. Even if Shahn's 50 or so covers do not have the variety of forms of a David Stone Martin, Ben Shahn is one of the pioneers of early cover design. The album covers published on the market do not really reflect the full range of his artistic work. I have brought two examples with me, and let me show you the first one. It's the Three-Penny Opera by Bertolt Brecht from 1958 by Kurt Weill, where he designed the cover. Let me make some space here so that we can put on this cover. So we talk about this one, the Three-Penny Opera. And Ben Shahn often works in his drawing pen method, a type of drawing in which he can apply a specifically individualized style using ink or India ink. His works do not exceed the limits of the cover, but rather fit into the given space of the cover. His covers often have a very provisional, sketchy character. I have another nice example from 1961. It's the music by Robert Prince for two chess ballets on RCA, which is this one. Shahn's record covers take on a different dimension due to his position in the visual arts. Commissioning visual arts to design the covers was recognized as an independent sales factor. In a cover series in collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the argument that the cover design was by a visual artist was explicitly advertised. And here's another nice example that I would like to show. It's about the Cowboy Ballads from 1952 on the legendary Folkway Records. It's this one. Here you can see the cowboy. What is striking about Shahn is that he deliberately keeps his covers simple with sketchy depictions and largely avoids color or at most uses it for lettering. Other examples I would like to demonstrate is the Albert Schweitzer Bach edition, which is this one. And you can see here the angels in a bit that are reminiscent of Marc Chagall. And there's another nice example I would like to show, which is, let me make some space here. These are these ones from the Chicago Style Chess Records. And you can see also here the angels that remind us a lot at Marc Chagall. It should not be forgotten that Shahn sees his preferred expression in the fine arts. And he saw the works in the applied arts as an extension of his area of distribution.
Now I'm curious to see how you managed the curve to Andy Warhol.
Well, I think it's quite simple. To a certain extent, David Stone Martin was a role model for Andy Warhol's early covers. On the one hand, the drawing technique used by Warhol, the so-called blotted line technique, with its unevenly dripping and splashing pen stroke, is very similar to Martin's scroll quill pen point technique, in which he overstretches the pen. Warhol also initially works with perspective, foreshortening, and there are a number of motifs that appear repeatedly in Steinway, Stone Martin, and Warhol.
Okay, that sounds really exciting.
Well, in the next podcast, episode 4, we will be talking about Andy Warhol's art covers. That fits quite well after we discussed the cover pioneers in the 1940s today, and we should talk seamlessly about Andy Warhol's extensive cover work. He started in 1949 and until to 1987, as he appeared early on with his art on record covers. And the focus is then on the connection between the cover and the facets of applied and fine art.
An artist I finally know, and I have seen many of his works in the museum. That will be interesting.